Hello everybody, welcome to Bitcoin Not Crypto. My name is Forrest Stevens, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about why Canada, the nation, my home country, specifically needs to adopt a Bitcoin strategic reserve, how they should go about it, and this is a bit of a follow-up to my last video, which is titled The First Country That Prints Money to Buy Bitcoin Wins. The real winners of Bitcoin, of course, are people who adopt it into their own personal life because it is harder money than these weak currencies that can be printed up out of nowhere. So if you want to get yourself some Bitcoin, I would recommend checking out Bitcoin Well. They're a non-custodial exchange, which means they never hold your Bitcoin for you. They send it directly to your wallet address. So you don't have any third-party counterparty risk. They also have non-KYC options available for Canadians, and they are available in the United States as well. They have an OTC desk for high net worth individuals that want to buy over $50,000 worth of Bitcoin, and they're very competitive there. And they also have a bonus reward system where if you use my link in the description, you can get some free Bitcoin. So the reasons why a nation would want to adopt a strategic Bitcoin reserves, I covered in my last video pretty extensively, but basically it's just like any other strategic reserve. It's in case you need it. We don't use any of those strategic reserves until we need to use them, just as we wouldn't use the Bitcoin strategic reserve that we had as a nation until we needed to. And in the future, there might be a need to, because other nations might only accept Bitcoin for certain trade. So just being diversified in your currency, just as we are now, we hold foreign debt, we hold foreign currencies, and we need to hold Bitcoin as well, because there will be nations that will only want Bitcoin for their goods and services. Canada is in a unique space where they can do that because we have our own currency, and in fact, our currency and debt is held around the world to some degree. Around roughly 24% of the debt is held by other nations, I believe. This is the information that I found, at least, which means when there is the issuance of new debt or more monetary debasement of our currency, then the effects of that will be spread out. The debasement of our currency gets spread out to some degree and affects us less here at home than if we didn't have the debt and currency being held by other nations. Canada's economy is relatively stable, and the Canadian dollar is relatively trustworthy around the world. I mean, it's no US dollar, but it's fairly trustworthy internationally. And the Bank of Canada could implement some sort of monetary easing or printing of dollars, Canadian dollars, without hyperinflation ensuing because of that relative stability. We have strategic reserves already in Canada of oil, natural gas, metals, different precious metals, things like that. Even maple syrup, we have a strategic reserve of. So it makes sense to diversify that into something like Bitcoin. And I'll get into more of why holding Bitcoin could be very beneficial, right? It's a financial instrument. It's the purest money that we've ever had. So holding something like that could be extremely beneficial. Canada already is positioned in a pretty decent way to adopt cryptocurrency and Bitcoin more specifically. We already have regulation around it. We have strong guidance. We accept it already as a population quite significantly. We have pretty good adoption. We have a lot of citizens that agree that Bitcoin is something to own, and the government has started to regulate it and has exchanges and companies within Canada that operate. We don't have outright bans of something like Bitcoin like some other nations around the world do. The reason we would want to do this, and especially there's a bit of a timely matter about this, we want to do this sooner than later, is it's game theory, right? If we do something or if a nation does something, you have to react as a nation. So if other nations around the world start adopting Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, then you have to as well. So but you benefit less from being someone who comes to the table second or third or fourth, right? The turkey leg's already gone if you get to the dinner table too late. The stuffing or whatever's eaten, right? So we want to get to Thanksgiving. We want to get to the Bitcoin table early and adopt it, because we would directly benefit by holding Bitcoin and other nations having to buy Bitcoin after that. And that would increase the price of Bitcoin and therefore increase the value of our strategic pile that we already have. So front running this, being early to the adoption, is really key in the value proposition of having an asset that appreciates at such a high level. So I mentioned that Canada is fairly stable in its economy. However, it is not growing rapidly. We have all these resources. We have an aging population. We have basically the biggest housing bubble in the world, in my opinion. We have a lot of kind of slowing down economic conditions. We have a brain drain happening. Anybody that can work at a US company and make more money goes to the United States and does that from Canada. They don't stay in Canada because you make a lot less money and your housing costs a lot more. So your way of life goes down if you stay in Canada as a working professional. So we need to reverse that. We need to tap into growth. The government handles all sorts of different growth initiatives. I know the current prime minister, he ran on a huge campaign of investing in infrastructure. And I'm not sure that investing in infrastructure has outperformed Bitcoin, right? It definitely has not, because the compound annual growth rate of Bitcoin over roughly the last 10 years has been around 60%. And it's been about 33% over the last 5 years. So these different periods will have different compound annual growth rates, but that's incredibly high when basically, if we look at the numbers here, the growth of Canada, basically the GDP per capita on average looks to be expected to be about 1.1%. So that's a compound growth rate of GDP improvement of 1.1. We need to tap into something that grows our nation faster than that. And Bitcoin is the answer to that. You tap into this incredible network of this financial network, and you can get the gains of that. And the way basically budgets work and assets and liabilities work is if you increase the assets, you can offset the liabilities. Right now, it's actually pretty insane, but the total debt to GDP in Canada is like insane. The debt to GDP ratio is approximately 106.8%. So we have more debt than GDP every single year. And that just means like how do you get out of that? You have to have some sort of growth. You cannot really work your way out of that. It's the beginning of a debt spiral, right? And people say, well, it's kind of the way that nations work and the way the debt and GDP work is all these countries are so in debt that it becomes sort of like the cleanest shirt in the laundry. Because they're all in debt, the ones that are a little bit less in debt or the ones that have future growth that are better get a better debt ratings. So if you look at Canada's yield on their debt, this is a very interesting metric, especially when considering printing money and buying Bitcoin. So right now, the benchmark yields for some longer term bonds of Canadian bonds. So let's go, the 2-year here is 3.08% and the 10-year is 3.34%. So if you, as a nation, as a central bank, which is tied in with basically the Canadian government, if you issued debt directly and got Canadian dollars for that debt and swapped it for Bitcoin, and the annual compound growth rate of a Bitcoin was 33%, as I said, you can knock 3% off of that for the debt interest yield that you had to pay, and you'd be growing your asset at 30% compounded annual growth rate at an average rate of 30%, which is totally possible into the future. Instead, what we do here as a nation is we think of more complex GDP growing activities, and yet we are still only at 1.1% outlook into the future of GDP growth. So, that's like infrastructure and all these types of things that, yes, they employ people, but it doesn't really noticeably grow the GDP. We need to do that. But on the side as well, we need to also tap in to this ability to increase our current debt yield, our current debt amount by issuing currency and buying something that outgrows the debt, which is Bitcoin. So this might be seen by some people as risky, and that's because people think Bitcoin is risky. Some people do, at least. If you look at it over any 4-year period, it's just incredible returns. You could actually say that it is less risky than any of this debt because that debt performs like absolute dog turd, and Bitcoin just performs incredibly well over the long period of time. Volatility in the short term is something to be concerned about only if you have some sort of liquidation event. And as a country with a strategic reserve that can print its own dollars, why would you ever have a liquidation event unless some catastrophic thing? And at that point, you're going to be worried about, food and shelter and water if it's that catastrophic that you would have to sell your Bitcoin anyway. So there would also be concerns about inflation because of the idea of money printing, of creating new money. And this is kind of where I want to get directly and talk specifically about Canada's situation. So Canada has an abundant amount of renewable energy. We have a lot of hydroelectric. Even here in British Columbia, where I am, 90% of the electricity is renewable. So Bitcoin, one way to acquire it is through Bitcoin mining. And a lot of renewable energy, right? A dam is a really great example. Hydroelectric energy is a really great example. So there's a reservoir. There's a huge amount of water that gets pooled above the turbines, and gravity sucks it into the turbines, spins those, and creates electricity. Now they ramp up and down the amount of water flow into these hydroelectric dams based on demand. However, they have more capacity in a lot of these situations than they actually use. So what they could do is they could partner with Bitcoin miners, or they could actually fully do the Bitcoin mining themselves as a public entity. They could publicly fund it, and they could put Bitcoin miners at sites of renewable energy. There's actually a ton of flaring, natural gas flaring that happens at basically oil mines or oil drilling sites. And that natural gas flaring is just a technique to lower the environmental impact of the natural gas that just gets wasted. And it gets wasted because building the infrastructure to capture that natural gas is too costly to make it worth it. So you could actually put basically a Bitcoin mining operation directly on site. You could capture that natural gas, run it through a bunch of generators, and generate electricity with that natural gas. And that electricity would go to mining Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin that got mined would go to the strategic Bitcoin reserve. So there's a lot of ways, not just of printing money, to acquire Bitcoin, and one of them is tapping into the natural resources of Canada to acquire Bitcoin. Another way they could acquire Bitcoin is buying it, but they could do this by buying it through Canadian entities. They can help fund the developing technology that is Bitcoin services, and all of these Bitcoin technology companies that sell Bitcoin and operate that as part of their business. They could partner with them for discounts and deals, just as Bitcoin Well has an OTC desk and has, specialized fees and all that. The government could buy Bitcoin through an OTC desk like this, which would limit the impact. They could limit the impact of the price that they, the buying pressure that they have. And they could help fund these Canadian companies. And that would help, Bitcoin Well just expanded into the US, right? So basically by expanding into the US, they're now taking capital from a foreign nation and bringing that capital into Canada as business revenue. So if Canada indirectly started funding companies like that by just by using them, being a user, they would help fund those companies indirectly, and then they could expand, right? They could expand, and Bitcoin could be more important in this country. The other thing is Bitcoin is a bit of a cheat code. It is one of the biggest brands in the world. If we evaluated it and its market cap like a company, you would say that it is in the top 7. It's in the Mag 7, and it is it's something that a lot of people are very passionate about. So if Canada started to adopt Bitcoin early, this would drive a lot of people into this country, right? We started changing maybe some of the regulations around it, started becoming a Bitcoin friendly country. Then we would have a similar situation like El Salvador is having, where they're having a huge amount of people wanting to move here, wanting to invest here, or there in this case, in El Salvador as the example, and just a huge amount of boom of economic boom, right? So we would have that, right? It's a bit of a cheat code, people say, to adopt Bitcoin early. Canada has also acquired some Bitcoin throughout its past from criminal activity. They acquired basically $28 million, which I would in 2020, which I would estimate to be about 2,000 Bitcoin at the time. From ransomware attacks. They have not disclosed if they've sold this or not, but they could, if they haven't, which oftentimes they are forced because of regulations and laws to liquidate criminal seizures. They could just change that, right? Just as America has around 200,000 or so Bitcoin, that they could just simply change a law, move it from the Department of Justice to the Treasury. We could do the same, right? We could move it from our whatever the police, Department of Justice of Canada or whatever it is, to our treasury, right? And create a stockpile from the Bitcoin that the government already has, and it would just be moving it from one place to another and basically creating a reserve from that, as opposed to something that will just get liquidated. So in the short term, this could cause inflation, possibly, just because it's creating new money, and it will eventually work its way into the Canadian consumer economy, if it was through Bitcoin miners and that allowing them to be more profitable, or through Canadian Bitcoin businesses where they buy it, and then that goes towards that company being more profitable and them spending money on operations, and then that working its way into the system. So it would have a direct inflationary effect probably in the short term. However, in the long term, you again have to think about that balance. If you've acquired a asset that appreciates, you are a more stable country in this case, and you have more ability to issue debt. You have more ability to basically create interest in you as a country, because you are more valuable. You've created and you hold something that has gone up in value. And that's what Bitcoin does. Baked into it is number go up, because it's the only thing out there with absolute true scarcity. Any of these other cryptocurrencies can be changed at some point. Bitcoin, the supply cap will never be changed. And you can look at my BlackRock video that I made about that a couple episodes ago. I think that Canada needs growth. Otherwise, it will continue basically becoming irrelevant as a nation on the world stage. And I think that Bitcoin is that cheat code, is that easy way to just buy growth off the shelf. It is a way for us to get into the digital currency ecosystem and become a leader in that, as opposed to just barely participating as we are as a nation. And I think as individuals of this country, we would all benefit from our government making smart decisions and making financial decisions that make sense in the long term. And I think buying Bitcoin is one of those financial decisions that makes sense in the long term. I know I personally have done it, and it has made a lot of sense for me. And I think that it would make a lot of sense for nations for the exact same reasons as it works for the individual. However, I don't have a money printer, so Canada can do it at a lot less cost than I can, because they have access to a money printer. So think about that, and that's my argument for why Canada is well positioned to adopt a Bitcoin strategy, and why we need to front run other nations already doing this or will be doing this in the future, very near future. If you want to front run Canada and all the other nations that will inevitably be forced into Bitcoin adoption, if you want to voluntarily get into Bitcoin adoption during this early stage of the adoption curve, check out Bitcoin Well. Like I said, use my code Bitcoin Not Crypto, or click the link in the description and get a small little kickback, and it goes to support this channel, and you get some bonus reward points which can be redeemed for Bitcoin. So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.